All right, we're back with the second part of the lecture. We went over demand, and now we're going to go over supply. As you might have guessed, the first things to get into is the definition and the law of supply. Supply is the ability and willingness of a producer to provide a given quantity of goods or services at a given price at a given time. And just note, the law of supply basically says it's kind of the opposite of demand. As the price rises, quantity supplied rises. And let's talk a little bit about why that is. But before we do, you can kind of see the representations of the supply curve to your right, and you can see that as the price goes up, the quantity supplied also rises. Please also note, much like demand, the supply curve is kind of a representation of the data in the table. So again, the data in the table that shows producer behavior represents, the curve represents the data in the table. So you can kind of see that, that again, the diagram is just a representation of that data. So let's talk briefly about why is it that as price rises, quantity supplied rises. Well, that's due mostly to what we call the profit motive. Firms always like to make more profits. Profits are good, especially if you are, your salary is based on your profits. You will always want to raise your salary and make more money. Producers are motivated to make more products at a higher price. You can even look at the table. I mean, it's kind of obvious. Think of it if you were a producer and you were making something like, let's say you opened your own little, falafel shop, and you were making 2 falafels for $2. Would you be willing to make more at a higher price? Well, of course you would, because if you were making 2 falafels at $2, you'd only be making $4. You raise your price and your quantity, and if everybody's still buying them at that price and quantity, you're now making $20 instead of $2. So, of course, you're motivated to make more at a higher price. It's only natural. Again, the forces of demand will stop producers from raising prices indefinitely because they won't buy an infinite amount of goods that the producers want to sell. And that kind of acts as a check against supply. These two forces, these two concepts, supply and demand, work together to determine prices and quantity. All right, so let's just kind of go over one other point that's really important. Please note again that if there is ever a change in price, that is a movement along the supply curve. It is not a movement of the curve. So, for example, if we said the price of water bottles increased, or bottled water increased, we'd be moving from the red point to the blue point to the red point. That would be a movement along the curve. However, if there is ever any other reason listed besides price, that's what we call a determinant, and it caused the whole curve to shift. If we were looking at that same market for bottled water, and we're looking at producers' ability to produce, if plastic, which is a resource that producers need to create the bottles for bottled water, got cheaper, they would be able to produce more bottles at a cheaper price, and supply would shift to the right. So let's briefly go over the determinants of supply. They are technology, input prices, number of firms, price of other goods, expectations, taxes, subsidies, and supply shocks, or tin pets. I'm sure we could come up with another acronym, but let's just go over each one briefly. Technology. Technology usually allows firms to produce more goods at a lower price, and it usually causes supply to shift to the right. Again, if a firm can increase or get better technology, usually that technology helps them produce more. Input prices or resource prices. If the prices of materials goes down, or the price of labor goes down, then firms will be able to produce more at a lower price. It's kind of like in this example here, with the water bottles. If we had a demand curve created with this diagram on the right, you would kind of see that prices would be going down and quantity would be going up. But just note, the supply will be greater if, again, materials to produce a good or service are cheap or get cheaper. The supply will shift to the right, ultimately leading to a greater quantity and lower price. Number of firms. This is very simple. The greater the number of firms, the greater the supply. Or the greater, as firms, the number of firms increase, the supply increases. So again, if we have an increasing number of firms, supply will shift to the right. If the number of firms decreases, supply will shift to the left. Next, we have expectations. Firms can also change the supply based on what they think the price will be in the future. And this is, again, something they do largely out of the profit motive, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment. Taxes always shift supply to the left because they increase prices, and we'll kind of go over that too. So again, just remember, taxes shift generally things to the left. Subsidies are payments from the government. They shift things to the right. And finally, there are things like that are called supply shocks, and these are things like hurricanes, wars, natural disasters, and they can cause a big decrease or leftward shift in supply. So let's give you some examples. Let's look at the market for tires. Continental is a big manufacturer here in Hanover. What would happen if rubber became very expensive? Well, if it became very expensive, think to yourself, what would happen? Would supply get bigger, or would it get smaller? Would it shift to the right or to the left? If you said to the left, you're correct. The justification for that is input prices, right? Resources got more expensive. How about let's look at an example of subsidies for corn growers. Let's say the EU government decides to give people that produce corn here money. Just pay them. Give them money for producing corn to encourage maybe food security or something like that. If money is given from the government to producers, what will happen to supply? Will it shift to the left or will it shift to the right? If you said to the right, you are correct. And the justification is subsidies. Let's say that, let's look at the market for roses, and Valentine's Day is coming up here in about 6 months, so not that soon. But if the crop were to freeze right before Valentine's Day, what would happen to the supply? Would the supply increase or decrease? If you said the supply would decrease, you got it. And the reason for that is what we call supply shocks. Next, cigarettes. If the government puts a tax on cigarettes, what's going to happen to the supply of cigarettes? Is it going to increase or decrease? What will a tax do to cigarettes? It will cause it to decrease. Okay, so please note that the forces of supply and demand work together. The point where they cross is called equilibrium. It's the price, the equilibrium price and quantity. And let's kind of look at what happens when these two forces interact together. For example, oil refineries know that gas prices will rise in the summer. What will they do now? And this was written actually a little bit earlier. Some of these questions were. So, what would happen to the price of gas? If you're a producer and you know the price is going to go up, what are you going to do with all of the oil that you've got? You're going to go sell it right now? No, you're not. You're going to reduce the supply now so that when the summer hits, what can you do with the supply? The demand is up and the price is up. You would increase it in order to make more money. So again, this would do with the determinant would be producer expectations. Let's look at another example. One of the other, we're looking at the market for potato chips. However, people don't eat potato chips as much anymore. Maybe they've heard that they're very unhealthy and they're full of trans fats. and also the fact that pretzels are really, really profitable. So producers, if you're a producer of chips, you can produce either chips or pretzels. What are you going to produce? Well, if you know pretzels are bringing in the bucks, you're probably going to produce more pretzels and produce fewer potato chips. So supply would shift to the left. And, the reason would be price of other goods as the determinant. As we said earlier, equilibrium is the price where supply and demand intersect and the quantity where supply and demand intersect. It's basically represented by the dotted lines and points P, E, and QE. And we'll go into that more next time. But that's all for now. Thank you for listening. I hope this helps. Maybe take a look at your book too, and hopefully you'll get it. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Bye.